2 Corinthians chapter 2, verses 5 through 11. If anyone has caused grief, he has not so much grieved me as he has grieved all of you to some extent, not to put it too severely. The punishment inflicted on him by the majority is sufficient for him. Now instead you ought to forgive and comfort him so that he will not be overwhelmed by excessive sorrow. I urge you therefore to reaffirm your love for him. The reason I wrote you was to see if you would stand the test and be obedient in everything. If you forgive anyone, I also forgive him. And what I have forgiven, if there was anything to forgive, I have forgiven in the sight of Christ for your sake, in order that Satan might not outwit us. For we are not unaware of his schemes. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Friends of Jesus, the question caught my attention because it was in block quote, one of those big quotes that you see at the side of the article that I was reading. I really don't remember why exactly I was reading an article about Marilyn Taves. I'd never heard of her before. She's a Canadian novelist. But she was talking in this article about her upbringing in a conservative Mennonite community in the Canadian prairies. And her question was this, as she described all the reasons she had left her faith behind. What good is forgiveness? What good is forgiveness? In my community, she writes, forgiveness was all, but really, forgiveness is nothing but permission to go on without changing. It's a religious construct, she said. Something that favors the oppressor, something that does nothing more than puts a Band-Aid on wrongs that have been committed. And Taves, unfortunately, has the stories to back up her opinions. Stories of sinful manipulation and abuse, wrongs overlooked, vulnerable people who got hurt when nothing changed. What good is forgiveness? Is she right? I mean, what if forgiveness is just an excuse to overlook the real sins people have committed? What distinguishes genuine mercy from cheap grace? These are important questions because in recent years we've become much more aware of some of the awful things that maybe were glossed over in the past in the name of forgiveness. Child abuse, sexual violence within and outside marriage, racial injustice, hostility towards those struggling with questions of gender or sexual identity. The pain from the cheap grace and avoidance of these issues in the past has become part of the reason for a strong backlash against these sins today. We talked about cancel culture last week, right? There's a desire to say, you know what, these things were bad and we don't want them to happen again. And in many ways, there is a good impulse in that, an impulse to name the injustices that have been done and to say we're going to try to put things in place that make sure that they don't happen over again on our watch. But the question is that all there is? Does forgiveness still have a place? Or is it really just a cover that makes us feel good about the fact that we can go on sinning? How we apply forgiveness is the central question of this morning's text in Paul's second letter to the Corinthians. Actually, if you read between the lines, he'd written other letters. We don't have them anymore, but this is the second one that we have. And in this letter, Paul is addressing, or in this section of the letter, Paul is addressing the process of forgiveness, and especially forgiveness for something very public and very serious. And there's 4 phrases that I want to pick out from these verses this morning that help us think about that process, about the necessity, the progression of steps of forgiveness in a public setting like this. And the first is the line in verse 5 where Paul talks about someone who has caused grief. Now, in order to understand what we're reading here, we need to go back and figure out a little bit of background to what Paul is talking about. In 1 Corinthians chapter 5, Paul is addressing a situation where a church member is carrying on some kind of affair with what seems to be a stepmother. Now, we don't know the specifics. Paul is kind of vague. Obviously, the Corinthians knew what he was talking about. But whatever was going on is bad enough that it was starting to damage the reputation the church had with those who were outside the congregation. Well, the church seemed not only to tolerate, but somehow celebrate what was going on. And Paul had tried to address this, and in trying to address this, it seems like there is some pushback to Paul as well, that they're angry with him for even trying to bring it up. Now, again, you read some of this stuff from a distance, and you go, well, that's crazy. Why would a church ever do that? But again, I think if we try to put ourselves in these kinds of situations, there are things that all of us want to defend that in our own lives, that when somebody tries to correct us, tries to say, hey, Joel, maybe you shouldn't do it that way, we get prickly. And we push people away, and we dig in our heels, and we say all the more, nope, I'm going to do it this way, right? Especially in an individualistic culture. I want to do it my way, I want to do it right away, and I want to do it now. And so as a result, Paul gets insistent that the church apply formal discipline to this man, that they call public attention to his sin and try to bring him back to repentance. Now, sometimes when we hear about church discipline, it has kind of a bad taste in our mouth. We view church discipline as being something like, we're going to take this person, we're going to vote them off the island, right? But when we read the Bible, we read Jesus' words in Matthew 18. Matthew 18, verses 15 to 20 is where Jesus addresses the process of church discipline and kind of lays out the template for what we do in the church. And when we read our own Reformed confessions, the Heidelberg Catechism, the Belgic Confession, when they talk about church discipline, we see that it's portrayed in terms of the larger witness to the work of Christ in our lives as individuals and as a community. Discipline, in other words, is never a knee-jerk reaction. There should not be cases where yesterday we learned about something bad that somebody did, and today we kick them out of the church. Listen to the Heidelberg Catechism and its description of how we apply discipline. Discipline is applied to those who profess unchristian teachings or live unchristian lives. So it becomes known in the community over time that somebody is teaching or doing something that does not reflect the way that we understand we are to live the Christian life. And then, after repeated and loving counsel, so somebody decides that they're going to have a conversation. My life is going off the rails, and somebody comes to me and says, Joel, do you see what's going on? Look at yourself. Line it up against God's word. Look at what the impact is on the wider community. So after repeated and loving counsel, and after being reported to the church, that is, to its elders, its leaders. So after a while, somebody's been trying to talk to me and they can't get anywhere with me. Then they say to the leadership of the church, hey, this continues to go on. Do you have any wisdom that you can maybe share? And it's only then, after they fail to respond to that admonition, that then discipline happens, formal excommunication happens. In other words, this is a long process. Sometimes it goes on for years. And the goal is always restoration. Not punishment, not slapping somebody on the wrist because they did the wrong thing, but calling them back to a relationship with God and his people. And that apparently was what happened in Corinth. The sinner repented, he admitted his guilt, he stopped bad-mouthing Paul and the other leaders in Corinth, and he amended his ways. He ended the relationship that was sinful. But there's still a reality there. This person caused a lot of grief, and that bothered the church. And I'm really glad that Paul puts it this way, because sometimes being able to name this dynamic is a really important step in the process of forgiveness. It makes sense. It's one thing to forgive or to tell yourself you're forgiving, but it's another thing to forget what happened. The thing that gives offense may be over and done with, but I still have to deal with the grief of what's been done. My trust has been broken. My reputation has been damaged. I may have a sense of shame to deal with because I'm connected to your sin or because you're connected to mine. I might be suspicious that you're going to do the same thing all over again. And to quote the story from Corrie ten Boom last week, can all of this be erased just because somebody asked and said, will you forgive me? There's a process. There's a process for working through grief. And sin causes grief, in both senses of that word. We have to recognize that grief is not limited to one or two people or even just a small group. Sin spreads. It infects everything around it. As Paul notes here in Corinth, this one man's actions had not only affected him and his lover, it had divided the church, it had harmed its witness. He caused grief in the sense of trouble, and Paul insisted that these actions had also become a source of grief, sorrow for the whole congregation, and it's okay to name that grief. And to say, just because an action stopped doesn't mean that grief is not still there. And I also find it helpful, secondly, that Paul talks about punishment in verse 6. Now, the idea behind punishment, behind the word that's translated punishment, is not so much a beating or a fine as it is a sort of an official rebuke. The goal of discipline in the church, remember, is not so much the implementing of a penalty for something as it is a means of restoring sinners to each other and to God. And so the focus in church discipline is not so much on shaming or embarrassing the sinner. But one of the challenges is to name a wrong as a wrong. And in some ways, this is easier to do in a situation like this one in Corinth, where the wrong was out there for everybody to know. It's much harder to know how to do this when the sin is something private and where we don't know how to go with it. How do we name a wrong as a wrong? And too often, churches and individuals sweep sin under the rug in an attempt to pretend that things are all right, that we've worked through it, we're past it now. But the tragic results are perhaps most evident right now in the fallout from the sexual abuse scandals in the Roman Catholic Church. But it's no less serious when we fail to address anger issues, or pornography, or racial injustice, or greed, or any of those other sins within the church. And forgiveness does not mean that there are no consequences for the sinner. Sometimes I cringe when I hear stories of pastors who confess their guilt for some sort of public offense. Maybe it's adultery, or maybe it's financial mismanagement, something like that. But they confess it off the pulpit, and there's this tear-filled apology for breaking trust, and then they act as if maybe next week, or maybe after a period of 2 or 3 months of, they can resume their activities as if nothing has happened. Now, I also don't want to give the impression that there's a one-size-fits-all approach that somehow says, if we just do this, and we follow these steps and this length of time, then we'll get through the process and it's okay to forgive. But I think it's important that we name sin as a serious matter that can't be dealt with even by a single public confession. There's a reason that churches and other organizations develop policies to try to protect and put situations and frameworks for accountability in place. For example, we have a policy, as do many churches, that prohibits anyone with a felony conviction or a child abuse conviction from serving in ministry to youth. That's not meant to be punitive. It's meant to be a consequence of sin, indicating that what has been done is a serious matter that has continued effects in the community and its ability to trust and to protect. But the same thing could be true in other relationships. If your marriage has been plagued by an affair or by emotional abuse, it's not realistic to assume that you can just snap your fingers and restore the trust that's been broken simply by saying, the adultery stopped, or my spouse is committed to being nice to me from this point forward. Accountability is a realistic, even necessary consequence and step towards rebuilding trust. And a truly repentant sinner should recognize that consequences are not necessarily an unjust response to hurt that's been inflicted by his or her actions. But then Paul shifts gears a little bit, and he starts talking about some other things, because accountability and consequences are different than a continued rebuke. Continually to hold up in front of somebody that they're a sinner. I mean, yes, theologically, in some ways, this is true. We are always sinners. We never stop being sinners this side of heaven. But that's different than naming you only as a sinner. Which is why it's important for us to hear Paul's insistence that the church, verse 8, reaffirm your love for the sinner. And again, there's an idea behind this phrase. It's actually kind of a legal one. Reaffirm, enforce, validate, confirm. Now, if you're like me, you hear those words and you hear, wait a second. Reaffirm, enforce, validate, confirm your love for the other person? That seems like a little bit of an oxymoron when love is the object. How do you enforce your love for another person? I think the word choice here reminds us that love is something that starts with our own heart. Forgiveness, a willingness to forgive, is something that starts with our own heart. We talked about that at the end of last week's message too. Because the reality is that I cannot make another person change their way. And when I think about this for myself, I realize that when I struggle with forgiveness, when I'm struggling to let go of something that somebody did to me, it's often because what I really want is to force the other person to undo the thing that they did that hurt me in the first place. And when they don't undo it, which of course is impossible, right? But when they don't undo it, I kind of get angry. Now, all of this is going on kind of subconsciously, because when I put it that way, you go, oh, of course you can't undo what got done. But that doesn't stop us from wanting that to happen, does it? When they don't take away the hurt for what they've done and how it affects me, I get upset. I read an article recently from a secular psychologist who works with a lot of inner city kids, gangs, drugs, and that sort of thing. She talked about the healing process, the process of how do you change relationships and rebuild trust. And she commented that one of her discoveries on working with these situations over the years is that often our feelings about other people are actually a reflection of our feelings about ourselves. When someone says, in other words, I can't trust you anymore, in some ways it's a way of saying, I don't trust myself. I don't know how to do the right thing. I don't know how to handle my feelings for what's going on. See, enforcing our love, it comes in Paul's telling from forgiveness and comfort for the one who sinned. Forgiveness and comfort. Saying the words and then doing some actions that says, we're working towards something here. We're on a process. Going back to the psychology article again, she says this involves accepting our own struggle to be righteous in the way that we deal with others. And that makes sense, doesn't it? If there's been a wrong committed, I want to right that wrong. But I know in the process that I'm not really as righteous as I'd like to be. Maybe I'm righteous in this thing, but over here, somebody else could find something that I did wrong over here, and so I look like a hypocrite, and I don't know, I'm feeling the tension, the anxiety that comes from those two feelings. And our strong emotions then often lead us to feel out of control, she says. We either lash out in vengeance at the other person, or we find ways to bury or perhaps even medicate those emotions in order to cope. And so it takes an act of the will to tolerate our own feelings, and then to turn around and take action to deliberately enforce, put into practice our love for the other person who has sinned against us. And what's true psychologically is even more true spiritually. Once in a while somebody will come to me with a conversation about, I don't know how to kind of work through this. One of the things I've often said to people, and I have to remind myself of it too, is that we can't undo the past. We can't change the decisions that we made last year or 2 years ago or 15 years ago, or the things that have happened to us because of somebody else's decision. We can't change it. But what we can do is to seek to live faithfully one day at a time as we move forward, to figure out how to honor God, live in obedience to Him, and live in the grace that He and others give us. Practicing forgiveness may begin with small steps. Restoration involves words. I forgive you. But it also may require that we, as the forgiver, pray that God would help us to really mean it. It may mean that we surround ourselves with people, and again, we don't have to, if this is something kind of sensitive and private, we don't have to involve the entire community, but a couple of people who know what happened, what we're struggling with, and who can say, hey, how are you doing with that? And to whom we can say, I'm really upset. This is a hard one today. It may mean being honest about what accountability and change look like for the sinner. Because changing sin is not just behavioral change. It wasn't enough for the guy in Corinth just to move out. We have to deal with the heart attitudes that led to the sin in the first place. And here I think the Psalms can be of so much value, because the Psalms are public expressions of the ways that God's people have dealt with all of these different emotions over the years. The anger over sin, the shame that the sinner feels, the lament over the brokenness that was left in the wake of what happened. And to bring all of that before God, the sense of helplessness that says, God, I don't know how to deal with this, but I trust that you do. Now, reading between the lines a little bit in Corinth, what does this mean? Well, this sinner in Corinth needed not just somebody to say, hey, you ended the relationship, didn't you? But he needed a web of relationships with people who would gently challenge the arrogance that led him to previously reject critique of his incestuous relationship. He needed that. One of the hardest things in our individualistic culture is to learn obedience. And Paul addresses that, not just for the sinner. Yes, the sinner needed to learn obedience. But he says the whole congregation in some ways needed to learn obedience. And they needed to learn obedience not just by enforcing discipline and saying this sin has to stop, but they're also really learning obedience from this point forward, figuring out, how do I love this person again? Recognizing what they've done. But how do I love them? Obedience comes from the practice. Notice the word, practice of forgiveness. Just like any skill, we grow in our ability to forgive as we take the steps to tell ourselves that we really mean it. Then when we move towards a sinner with concrete steps that say that the relationship matters enough to keep working on, even if forgiveness isn't perfect yet. And as a person who needs forgiveness, we practice this by moving towards the person we've wronged, respecting their hurt, respecting what has happened and the consequence of our sin, even if our obedience, perhaps, is not completely perfect either. But reaffirming our love is not just for us or for the other person. Forgiveness and restoration is not primarily about working through our own issues or making the other person feel better and like they can belong again. That's part of it. But in Christian community, that's not really the highest goal that we have. And so Paul reminds us at the end of this section that really forgiveness is in the sight of Christ. Forgiveness is a way of expressing the truth of the gospel that you and I are forgiven people because of what Jesus has done for us at the cross by bearing our punishment, by bearing the curse of everything that you and I have done that offends God and hurts our neighbor. And so Paul commands us in verse 11 to forgive so that Satan might not outwit us. And I've read this passage before. I imagine many of you have read it before also. But that phrase this week really just caught my attention. Why do we forgive? So that Satan might not outwit us. So that Satan wouldn't get the best of us. I think one of the places that Satan maybe has the biggest inroad into my life, and I'm guessing into many of our lives, is this area when we've been hurt. When somebody has wronged us in a really big way. Because in many ways, we are justified in wanting that to be set right. We are justified in saying, this was really, really bad, and I'm upset about it. But Satan uses that then to be the thing that we see and can't let go of. The thing that keeps us from really seeing and understanding the grace of God toward us. Our struggles to forgive are the places where Satan is getting the best of us, where he's getting the best of me. when we demand vengeance, when we hold grudges, when we identify a person in our minds by their sin rather than their name. We talked about that last week too. When I see you or you see me, all you can think about is, oh, there was that time when Joel did. When we do those things, we're giving in to Satan's devices. Now, Paul says next, well, we aren't ignorant of the devil's schemes. I love it. Paul's far more, probably pastoral than I would be. I'd say, no, we're ignoring the devil's advices. And Paul says we know it. We do know it. But sometimes we're ignorant. We pass over it. We pretend that maybe this thing really isn't as serious a struggle spiritually for me as it should be. We don't pay attention to what the gospel means for us, and so we ignore the ways that we fail to put our faith into action in the practice of forgiveness. And this is not an easy practice, an easy process. I read a quote from one wronged wife this week. She said, being wronged is miserable. It is. But she said, I had to realize that doing the wrong exacts a greater toll in every way. It is a lighter burden to be the forgiver than the one being forgiven. But I felt as if I, the wronged one, had no rights. I was just supposed to forgive, bear it, and go on. Everything that Marilyn Taves was complaining about. And she looked back at her own upbringing. And so what we're called to do again is to look to the gospel of Jesus Christ. To realize that we've been forgiven, and that makes us into people who are able to forgive. Now notice, I didn't say that makes us into people who find it easy to forgive, because it doesn't. People, rather, who recognize that the grace of God, which pours out condemnation, should pour out condemnation on us, poured that out on Christ instead. And if the condemnation that should come our way can be redirected on him, then we are able to do the same for those around us. Theologian Miroslav Volf is a native of Croatia who emigrated only shortly before war broke out in the former Yugoslavia in the 1990s. And talking about his own wrestling with what happened in his native country after he had left, he writes in a memorable image of the way that God's people take the puzzlement and rage of injustice. And I like that. Because when we've been wronged in big ways, it leaves us kind of scratching our heads and saying, how do we take these pieces and put them back together in a way that somehow there's a big picture once again? He says, the message of the crucifixion is this: rage belongs before God. By taking unattended rage before God, we place both our unjust enemy and our own vengeful self face to face with a God who loves and who does justice. Rage belongs before God. So what use is forgiveness? Well, in the end, it keeps us from being bound by Satan's lie that says that we, you and I, are the instruments of justice in the world. That's what I want to believe. If I've been wronged, I want to think that I've got the ability to fix it. Or if there's some injustice out there and somebody comes to me and says, boy, this is a problem, I want to fly in there and be the one to solve it and fix it all. But I can't. I can't. What you and I can do is to be witnesses to the justice and the mercy of a God who is good. A colleague of mine in the CRC writes of a conflict between him and another believer, and he writes about the attempts to reconcile over a period of time. He said, we finally had to sit down and have coffee. And I had a chance to express our pain and just to say, you know what, this hurt me. When you did this, this is how I felt. He said, some of the pain still lingers. We didn't work it all out just by saying in there, when you said this, this is how I felt. He says there are switchbacks in the pathway of forgiveness. But in time, he writes, our commitment to forgiveness helps pain to fade. Walking the path of forgiveness is not always easy in marriage, in family, or community. But it's vital, and it's transformative. So in response to God's gracious forgiveness, we make the commitment to walking the path of forgiveness for ourselves. Not as a Band-Aid for wrongs done with no change, but as a gracious expression of the way Christ himself looks at redeemed sinners like you, like me. Let's pray.